I never expected anything to change after 60. Life had settled into a rhythm, quiet, steady, predictable. I lived in a modest home in the town of Willowbrook, just east of Pine Falls, where the streets were lined with tall birch trees and folks still waved when they passed by. My days mostly revolved around the garden, the kettle on the stove, and the sound of bird song that drifted through the open windows. Before I begin, I just want to thank you for being here with me. If you've ever felt like life slowed down too much or wondered if something unexpected could still happen, you might want to stick around. And hey, if this story speaks to you, leave me a comment or tap that subscribe button. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, back to that morning. It was early May, and the tulips had just started to bloom along the back fence. The air was warm, but still carried that crisp scent of spring like fresh earth and sunlight. I was kneeling by the garden bed, my straw hat tilted to block the glare, humming an old melody that had been stuck in my head for days. My gloves were worn and caked with soil, the kind of comfort that comes from use, and my knees protested with every shift in weight. Still, it was where I felt most like myself. I didn't hear him at first. It wasn't until a shadow crossed my path that I looked up and saw someone standing a few feet behind me just outside the fence. "Those tulips are going to be beautiful in a week or two," he said, voice low but kind. I startled slightly and turned hand over my chest. "You gave me a scare." He smiled, and the familiarity of it hit me before I could place the face. Taller now, broader. His hair was longer than I remembered, tied loosely at the nape, and his skin was sun-warmed and freckled. "It's me, Caleb, from next door," he said. And suddenly, I remembered. Caleb Whitaker. Used to ride his bike around the cul-de-sac with a wobbly front wheel delivering flyers for his dad's hardware store. That had to be, 15 years ago. "Caleb Whitaker," I said, standing with some effort and brushing the dirt from my knees. "My goodness, I haven't seen you since you were, 13 and a half, he said with a grin, holding up his hands. "But I promise, I've grown since then." I laughed before I could stop myself. There was something easy in his tone, something soft in the way he looked at me, not the way young people often look at older women like we're invisible. He saw me, really saw me. "I was just visiting my aunt," he said, nodding toward the house 3 lots down. "She said you still kept the prettiest garden on the block. Thought I'd take a walk and see for myself." "Well," I said, suddenly aware of the dirt on my cheeks and the sweat at my brow. "You caught me mid-dig." "I can see that," he said, gesturing to the spade in my hand. "Mind if I help?" For a second, I hesitated. I wasn't used to company in the garden. It was my place of solitude, of quiet. But something in the way he stood there, relaxed, patient, made it hard to say no. "All right," I said, handing him the spare pair of gloves I kept by the shed. "You can start by helping me plant the rest of these tulips." He knelt beside me without a word, and for the next while we worked in tandem. I handed him bulbs. He dug the holes. We talked, but not too much. Mostly little things, his landscaping work in the next town over the stubborn clay soil that refused to let go of my trowel, the birds that always nested too early in the year. At one point, our hands touched as we both reached for the same bulb. It was brief, nothing deliberate. But it sent a current up my spine that surprised me. I glanced at him, and he was already looking at me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but like he was trying to remember something about me. Like he was trying to place a version of me he used to know with the one sitting in front of him now. "Do you ever feel lonely out here?" he asked so gently it didn't sound intrusive. I hesitated, the breeze catching the brim of my hat. The truth rose before I could stop it. "Sometimes," I said, "but I keep myself busy. The quiet has its own kind of music." He nodded as though he understood completely. And I think in that moment, he did. When we finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans and stood. "I'd like to come back if that's okay. Maybe bring a few cuttings from my own garden." I blinked, surprised by how much I wanted that. I'd like that very much, Caleb. As he walked down the path, he turned once and lifted a hand in farewell. I stood there watching until he disappeared around the corner, the scent of tulips and lavender thick in the air. My heart, which had settled into stillness for so long, felt the faintest stirrings of something new, something alive. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was the first petal of something quietly, beautifully unfolding. 3 days passed slow and quiet, as they always did. I didn't admit to myself that I kept glancing at the gate more often than usual, or that I checked the soil twice to see if the tulips had taken root faster, as if they might mirror some internal shift I couldn't yet name. It was Thursday afternoon when I heard the gate creak again. I was trimming the edges of the rose bush near the fence, sweat dotting my brow beneath the hat, when I turned and saw him, Caleb, pushing the gate open with his elbow. A small tray of seedlings balanced in his hands. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, grinning. "Brought a few things I thought you might like." He held the tray up slightly, and I stepped forward to get a better look. Neatly arranged rows of tiny green shoots, basil thyme, a few heirloom tomato sprouts. The kind of plants that promised long summer evenings and slow, fragrant meals. "You always show up with plants," I said. "Occupational hazard," he replied. "Besides, you've got the best soil on the block." I smiled, trying not to show just how much I'd been hoping he would actually come back. We spent the next hour working shoulder to shoulder again. This time, the rhythm was easier, less like strangers sharing space, and more like a conversation without urgency. He asked about my favorite dishes to cook, and I told him about the summer I tried to grow an entire Italian garden and ended up with 26 zucchini and nothing else. He laughed, not in a mocking way, but with the kind of joy that makes a person feel heard. "I've always loved things that grow," he said quietly, pressing a seedling into the soil. Maybe because I grew up around things that didn't. I looked at him, but he didn't elaborate. I didn't press. Some truths I've learned are better revealed slowly. When we finished planting, I offered him lemonade, and we sat beneath the big oak in the yard, the bench worn but sturdy beneath us. The shade was cool, and the air smelled of tomato leaves and damp earth. He held the glass with both hands, resting his forearms on his knees. For a while, we didn't speak. It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. Then, as if pulled from a memory he'd been holding on to too long, he said, "You know, when I was younger, I used to watch you from across the street. You always looked so calm, like the world couldn't touch you." I turned, slightly unsure what to say. "You were the only adult who seemed at peace," he added. I didn't know what that meant back then, but I remember thinking, that's what safe looks like. His words landed like soft stones in still water. Not loud, not heavy, but deeply felt. "I never thought of myself that way," I said. He looked at me, then really looked. "Maybe you were just too busy living it to notice." I glanced down at my hands, dirt still clinging beneath the nails, skin worn from years of work and weather. They didn't look graceful, but in that moment, I believed him. I believed that someone had once seen me that way, even if I hadn't seen it myself. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. He stood and held a hand out to help me up. I took it. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. When our fingers brushed, I felt that same jolt again, not the electric kind that knocks you over, but the quiet, grounding kind that reminds you you're still here, still capable of feeling something real. "Should I come back next week?" he asked. "You better," I said, smiling despite myself. He walked back through the gate, this time slower, as if reluctant to let the day go. And when I turned back to look at the freshly planted seedlings, I realized something had shifted. Not just in the garden, but in me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just watching the days go by. I was part of them again. The weather turned warmer over the next few days, the kind of slow, southern heat that seemed to settle deep into the soil and linger in the corners of the house. I adjusted my routine, rising earlier to beat the sun watering before breakfast trimming when the breeze still held some coolness. I told myself not to expect him again. I'd told myself that before, of course. But there was still something about the quiet that made it hard to ignore how often I checked the driveway or paused at the kitchen window longer than I needed to. It was Friday when I heard the gate creak again. I had just come inside to wash the dirt off my hands. The back door was open, letting in the scent of rosemary and warm grass. I dried my hands on a dish towel and stepped out onto the porch. He was there. Caleb, wearing a navy shirt that clung to his back from the heat and in his hands a small brown paper bag. "Hope I'm not too late," he said. "I brought something." He walked up the steps and gently pulled out 2 ceramic planters. They were small, hand-painted each with delicate vines curling along the edges in soft green and blue. One had a tiny chip near the rim, but it only made them feel more real, more personal. "I made these," he said, almost shyly. "Thought your lavender might like a new home." I ran my fingers along the rim of the nearest pot. The glaze was smooth and slightly uneven. Not perfect, but beautiful. Honest. "No one's made something for me in a long time," I said. He didn't say anything right away. Just smiled a little, the kind of smile that doesn't need a response. We repotted the lavender in silence, each of us focused on the careful transfer, the firming of soil around delicate roots. The silence between us was no longer something to fill. It was its own kind of presence, gentle and familiar. When we finished, I found myself saying, "Would you like to come in for a glass of tea?" I hadn't planned it. The invitation just came out soft and natural. He nodded. The kitchen felt cooler than the porch, the fan spinning above us with a lazy hum. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and set them on the old wooden table, its surface still scarred from years of family dinners and impatient homework nights. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on a framed photo by the fireplace. It was an old picture of my late husband and me taken on a picnic 20-some years ago. He didn't ask about it right away, just took a sip of tea and looked out the window. But after a moment, he asked, "Do you miss him?" I didn't look away from the photo. Not every day. Not the way I used to. It's different now. He's not missing. He's just part of me. A quieter part. He nodded slowly. "I think he'd be proud of the life you've made." The words hit a tender place in me. Not because they were sad, but because they were true. I reached across the table without thinking and laid my hand over his. There was no calculation in the gesture. It just felt right. He didn't pull away. His thumb moved gently across the back of my hand, slow, steady. Not searching, just present. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. Eyes not leaving mine. "You're not," I said. And I meant it. He stood and came around the table, stopping just in front of me. I stood too unsure if my legs would hold steady, but they did. He didn't rush anything. We were close enough to feel each other's breath. He looked at me the way people look when they're afraid to speak a moment into being too soon. When he kissed me, it wasn't dramatic or movie perfect. It was careful, honest. A question more than a statement. And I kissed him back. When we pulled away, there were no words, just the warmth of his forehead resting against mine and the silence between us humming like a held note. We didn't do anything more that night. He stayed for a while longer. We talked, laughed, shared old stories. At one point, an old jazz tune came on the radio, and I told him how my husband and I used to dance in this very kitchen, just the 2 of us. He didn't say a word, just reached for my hand and gently pulled me close. We swayed slowly, both a little awkward but unbothered by it. His hand rested at my back, mine at his shoulder. And for a few minutes, we let the music do the talking. When he left, he kissed my cheek and said he'd see me soon. I stood at the window after he'd gone, tea glass still on the table, music still playing softly. The house was quiet again. But it didn't feel empty. It felt full, like something had returned to it. Or maybe like something new had entered and decided to stay. The days that followed carried a softness I hadn't felt in years. I moved through them with quiet intention, watering the garden, rearranging the books on the shelf that hadn't been touched in months, even pulling out an old linen dress I hadn't worn since my last birthday. I didn't wear it for anyone in particular, only for the feeling it gave me. Caleb hadn't said when he'd come again, but some part of me trusted he would. And then on Sunday afternoon, I heard his knock. Not at the gate this time, but at the front door. When I opened it, he stood there holding a woven basket filled with groceries, fresh herbs, a small bottle of olive oil, tomatoes still warm from the sun. He wore a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled and jeans streaked with flour. His hair was damp at the edges like he'd just showered. "Thought I'd cook for you," he said. "You always pour me tea and give me this space like it's mine. Figured I could give something back." I stepped aside, smiling in that quiet, surprised way I'd come to recognize in myself. He moved easily into the kitchen, already familiar with the rhythm of it placing things gently on the counter like he belonged. We moved around each other with the kind of unspoken ease that only grows from comfort. He chopped while I stirred music playing low on the old radio tucked behind the flour tin. It was nothing special, just a simple melody from a forgotten decade, but it filled the air like memory. He told me about a new landscaping job he'd picked up outside of Pine Hollow. A community garden designed for older residents, raised beds so no one had to kneel, wide walking paths for easy access. "I thought about you when I saw the layout," he said, voice soft. "Not that you need it. You're more capable than half the folks I know." I laughed and shook my head. "There's still dirt in my shoes from last week. But raised beds sound like heaven on some days." He paused. "I think people forget that care can be design, too." Dinner was simple, fresh pasta with herbs, roasted vegetables, and toasted bread brushed with garlic. We ate outside the sky, shifting slowly into its evening blues, the garden still holding on to the day's heat. The marigolds were in full bloom now, and the tomatoes had taken to their steaks like old friends. The meal was quiet in the best way. We spoke between bites, but not constantly. There was no need to fill the silence. It lived with us, familiar and kind. After the plates were cleared, we lingered. The porch lights flickered on with a soft hum, and the first fireflies began to rise from the edges of the yard like sparks. He leaned back in his chair, one arm resting on the table. I watched his face in the dim light, how calm he looked, how settled. "I didn't expect this," he said almost to himself. "Us, whatever this is." "Neither did I replied, keeping my gaze steady. "But I'm glad it happened." He turned to me fully. His expression was open, unguarded in a way that made me feel both vulnerable and safe at once. "I know there's an age gap," he said. "I know how it must look to other people. But none of that changes how I feel when I'm here. You make me feel steady, honest, seen." That word again. Seen. It landed in me with quiet weight. I'd spent years buried beneath routines, safe choices, polite roles. I'd lived as if that part of my life, the part that yearned, that burned, was already over. But here he was, speaking it into life again. "Love," I said slowly. "Attraction. Even being noticed." I thought I'd packed all that away, folded it up like an old dress I'd never wear again. I paused, my voice softer. "And then you walked into my garden, and everything shifted." He reached across the table for my hand. No performance in the gesture, no urgency, just presence. "I don't know where this leads," he said. "But I'd like to keep walking with you wherever it goes." I didn't answer right away. I let the quiet settle around us like a shawl. Let myself feel the steadiness of his hand around mine. Let myself believe that something unexpected could still grow in soil I thought had gone still. Then I smiled. Slow, sure. I'd like that too. We stayed on the porch until the stars came out, hands gently tangled between us, saying very little. The fireflies rose higher, and the breeze stirred the scent of mint and jasmine through the air. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic shift, only the warm, unfolding presence of two people sitting in the same silence and feeling truly together in it. The next few days moved with a quiet kind of anticipation. I didn't rush through my mornings like I used to. I lingered over my coffee, let the sunlight wash over the kitchen table, pulled weeds slower, as if each movement mattered. I found myself humming again songs I hadn't thought about in years. I baked more. I wore lipstick even when I wasn't expecting anyone. Not for anyone else. Just because it felt like honoring the version of me that was coming back to life. And in the mirror, something had changed. The lines were still there, the silver still shimmered through my hair. But my face was softer. As if I was remembering how to be someone I'd forgotten, someone with laughter in her chest and a flush in her cheeks. When Sunday arrived, I didn't pretend I wasn't hoping he'd show up. And he did. No tray of plants this time. No gloves. Just him, Caleb. Wearing a soft button-down and jeans, his eyes warm and familiar when I opened the door. It struck me suddenly how natural it felt to see him there. As if his presence no longer needed explanation. Thought I'd visit without a shovel in hand for once, he said, smiling. Is that allowed? Only if you're prepared to be fed, I replied, stepping aside. He followed me in, walking the path to the kitchen as if he'd done it 100 times. And maybe, in some invisible way, he had. Some people don't need time to feel like they belong. They just do. We didn't have plans. We didn't need them. He sat at the table, and I poured tea. We talked about small things, whether wild rabbits in the garden, the latest bird call I'd tried to identify. But beneath the surface, there was a current. A stillness that was rich, not empty. When the rain started tapping softly against the window panes, we fell into silence. The kind of silence that felt like rest. You ever think about starting over? He asked after a while. Every spring, I answered, only half joking. The garden demands it. He nodded, tracing the rim of his mug with his finger. Sometimes I think life is just a series of quiet replantings. You don't always notice them until something starts blooming where you forgot you even sowed. I looked at him and he was already looking at me. There was no flirtation in his gaze, no need. Just something deeper, recognition maybe, or trust. You've changed something in me, I said softly. Not in a big dramatic way. Just like someone opened a window that had been painted shut. I wasn't trying to, he said. I know, I smiled. That's why it worked. We ended up on the couch in the den, a blanket over our laps, the rain still whispering at the windows. He didn't sit far. His shoulder brushed mine. His hand eventually found mine without asking. I could feel his breath shift when he leaned his head against mine. Not in a way that asked for more, only in a way that said, I'm here. We didn't kiss that day. We didn't need to. The intimacy was in the quiet, the shared pause, the way he ran his thumb along my knuckle absent-mindedly, like he already knew my hands well. When he finally left, the sky had turned clear again, the last of the golden light stretching across the floor like melted honey. I stood at the door long after he'd gone. Not because I felt his absence, but because the house no longer felt empty when he wasn't in it. It felt like something new had been planted. And I, too, was beginning to bloom. The Willow Bend Spring Fair came every May. Whether the town was ready for it or not, stalls would line the park filled with fresh honey and quilts and jars of pickles labeled with peeling handwriting. There'd be music, slow and sweet, drifting from the old wooden stage near the fountain, and paper lanterns hung from trees like whispers waiting to be caught. I hadn't gone in years, not since David passed. Somehow the fair had felt too full, too loud, too alive for a woman who was learning how to sit with silence. But this year, when Caleb asked if I'd like to go, the answer came easier than I expected. Only if we leave before the pie eating contest, I said. He laughed. Deal. He picked me up just after 6, driving an old green truck that smelled like sun-warmed leather and peppermint. I wore a light summer dress and a scarf in my hair, unsure if it made me look youthful or foolish, but when he saw me, his smile lingered longer than usual. You look peaceful, he said, offering his hand to help me into the truck. It was just a small town fair, but something about being there with him felt like a quiet unveiling. People noticed. Of course they did. A woman my age walking beside a man his age, there would always be glances. But none of them felt sharp. More curious than cruel. And Caleb, he didn't seem to notice them at all. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. We walked slowly, stopping to sample Honey Watch children paint clay pots at a craft booth, listen to a bluegrass band tune their instruments. At one point, I felt his hand gently rest on the small of my back, not possessive, just there, and I realized I didn't mind who saw it. We found a bench near the lake's edge, the string lights from the fair twinkling in the water. It was quiet there, tucked beneath a sycamore, the music muffled by distance. Used to come here as a kid, Caleb said, looking out over the water. I'd steal sugar cubes from the tea booth when no one was watching. I think everyone knew, I said, nudging him lightly. He laughed. Probably. But they let me believe I got away with it. We sat in that soft quiet again. That familiar, weightless space that had begun to feel like our own. And then he said, I think about you when I'm not here. I turned, surprised not at the fact, but at how gently the words had landed. I don't mean to, he continued, but I do. I'll be walking through someone's yard, trimming hedges or hauling mulch, and something will remind me your laugh or how you tuck your gloves under the porch rail. It just happens. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I reached for his hand, not to answer him, just to hold something real in that moment. He looked at me with a steadiness I wasn't sure I'd ever had the courage to meet before. And under the warm yellow glow of the lanterns, I felt something settle between us. Not expectation, not uncertainty, but clarity. This isn't a phase for me, he said, and it's not about trying to fix something in either of us. I nodded slowly. I know. Good, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting. Because I like this. You, us, and I'm not going anywhere. We stayed at the fair longer than planned, long enough to hear the last song drift into the night, long enough for people to stop watching and return to their own conversations, long enough for me to realize that for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a woman trying to prove anything. I was simply living something beautiful. The week after the fair passed in a kind of golden quiet, the kind that settles in after something has shifted not loudly, not obviously, but enough that the air feels different. Fuller, somehow. Softer. I didn't see Caleb for a few days, and I didn't worry. He had work. I had a list of garden chores and a pantry in need of reorganizing. But still, there was an undercurrent of waiting that ran through everything. Not impatient, just aware. It was Thursday afternoon when I found the note. Tucked gently between the folds of the old garden journal I kept by the porch swing. His handwriting was unmistakable, neat, slightly slanted with a curl at the tails of his Y's. Stopped by. Didn't want to interrupt your nap. Dinner this Saturday, I'll bring dessert. See. I smiled at the words for longer than I probably should have, folded the note and tucked it into the pocket of my apron like something precious. Saturday came slow and sunny. I made roasted chicken with rosemary, a salad with pear slices and pecans, and set the table with the good plates I hadn't used since my youngest grandson's birthday. I opened the windows, let the breeze wander through the rooms, lit a single candle not for romance but for warmth. He arrived just after 6, carrying a pie in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. "You weren't supposed to outdo me," he said when he saw the table. "I didn't," I replied. "I just felt like making something that felt like care." Dinner was easy, the way it always was with him. We talked about the plants in bloom, a client of his who wanted to grow lemon trees in clay soil, and how many birds had decided my gutter was the perfect nesting site. But beneath it, something unspoken hovered. He cleared the dishes, insisting I sit. I let him. When he returned, he paused at the doorway between the kitchen and living room, drying his hands on a towel. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Do you ever wonder where this is going?" He didn't say it out of fear or doubt, just honesty. I set down my glass, folded my hands in my lap. All the time I said, and then I remind myself that wondering isn't the same as worrying. He came to sit beside me, his knee brushing mine. "I know I'm younger, and I know that brings questions neither of us can answer yet. But I also know this being around you doesn't feel like a compromise. It feels like grounding." I looked at him, really looked, at the steadiness in his eyes, the way he never flinched from stillness or silence. The man who had once been a boy with dirt under his nails and a crooked smile now sat before me, not offering a fantasy, just presence. "I spent so many years convincing myself that the best parts of love had already passed," I said, "that it had its time and I'd had mine. And then you walked into my garden with a tray of seedlings, and I realized how much I'd stopped letting things grow." He reached for my hand again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I didn't have the answer he was asking for, not in words. But I stood and walked to the small record player in the corner, flipped through the stack of old vinyls, and placed the needle on one that still held the echo of dances past. When the first notes rose, slow and familiar, I turned and offered my hand. He smiled, took it. We danced quietly in the space between the kitchen and living room, the windows open, the wind carrying in the scent of basil and night air. Our movements were slow, imperfect, but real. There was no declaration, no promises made too early, just two people swaying to a song older than either of us had felt in a long time. When the music faded, he kissed me, and this time I leaned in first. The summer stretched on. There were no dramatic moments, no big revelations, just the garden growing wild with color, the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway, his jacket on the hook by the door, the way he reached for my hand without needing to look, and me softening, opening, rooting into something unexpected. Some nights we sat on the back porch and said nothing at all, just watched the light fade, just breathed the same air. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. I was here, alive, seen,